It began with a single sentence, not shouted, not barked, but spoken softly in the flowing cadence of Arabic. The words slipped across the white linen table like a blade hidden in silk. The setting was Aria, one of Manhattan's crown jewels of fine dining. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across polished mahogany. Silverware gleamed violins played faintly in the background, and a bottle of vintage wine priced higher than a working man's truck rested in the hands of a server who moved with practiced grace. At that table sat Ethan Blackwell, a billionaire whose fortune was as vast as his reputation was merciless. Wall Street feared his phone calls. Rivals dreaded his smirk. He leaned toward his guest, a Saudi investor wrapped in traditional robes, and with a thin smile, he loosed the sentence. It was meant to be private. A cruel little joke in a tongue he believed no one else at the table or in the room could follow. His eyes glittered with amusement as he glanced at the waitress. To him, she was scenery, another invisible worker moving through his orbit, but he was wrong. The young woman standing before him understood every syllable. Her name on the payroll and the menus was Clara Monroe, 28 years old, auburn hair bound tightly in a bun, a uniform so crisp it could have been armor. To the diners, she was just another face. To the staff, she was dependable, quiet, unremarkable. But inside her, a storm had just torn open. For Ethan Blackwell had not simply made a joke. He had spoken a name, the Falcon of Damascus, a name that did not belong to the world of billionaires and boardrooms, but to the shadowed corridors of embassy safehouses and interrogation chambers. A name whispered only in the most secret halls of diplomacy and espionage. Clara's hand did not tremble. The wine flowed into the crystal glass as smooth as ever. Her face held the neutral mask she had worn for 2 years. But her heart slammed against her ribs like a drum of war. Blackwell laughed quietly, pleased with his little barb, until he noticed the stillness in her eyes. He reached for his fork, but it slipped clattering against porcelain with a sharp metallic ring that cut through the hum of conversation. And then, in a voice as steady as steel, Clara answered him. She answered in flawless Arabic. The restaurant seemed to freeze. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The investor's hand stopped above his glass. Ethan Blackwell's smile faltered, the color draining from his face. The room for a heartbeat belonged not to the billionaire, but to the waitress he had tried to dismiss. And in that instant, everything changed. For 2 years, Clara Monroe had lived behind glass. Not the kind that shielded her from the world, but the kind that disguised her within it. Crystal glasses, polished windows, the elegant cages of high society. Aria, the 3-star Michelin restaurant perched in the heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side, had become her sanctuary. Every night was the same ballet. The air thick with the perfume of truffles, shaved paper-thin the sparkle of chandeliers reflecting against marble floors, and the steady hum of money flowing between titans of industry. She moved through it like a shadow, efficient, polite, unremarkable, invisible by design. The staff whispered that Clara was the best server they had. She never faltered, never lost her composure, never let a customer rattle her. She smiled when she had to bow out when she didn't. For the diners who spent more on a bottle of wine than most families did on a year's groceries, she was background scenery. And that was how she wanted it. But once, long before the white aprons and the silent grace of Arya, Clara Monroe had lived another life. In Damascus, she wasn't pouring wine. She was translating whispers carried over secure lines. She wasn't taking orders from wealthy diners, she was carrying them from ambassadors and operatives. Every syllable mattered. A single misinterpreted phrase could change the balance of an entire region. She was a handler, a voice in the darkness, the unseen bridge between a man risking everything and the government, desperate to hear him. That man was Tariq. To the outside world, he was nothing but another nameless dissident. To Clara, he was the Falcon of Damascus, a source of intelligence so vital that entire strategies bent around his words. And she had been the last person to hear his voice before it was silenced. She still remembered it. The static on the line, the hurried tone, the warning that something was wrong, that someone inside their circle had betrayed him. And then silence. 2 days later, the Falcon was dragged into the streets and executed before the cameras. Clara had survived, smuggled out under cover of night. But survival came with chains heavier than death. She carried the guilt like a scar. It was her translation that had gone through. Her watch when the line went dead. Her voice that could not save him. So she buried herself. In New York, in anonymity, in the endless rhythm of silver trays and folded napkins, until tonight. Hearing Ethan Blackwell casually breathe that name, the Falcon of Damascus, was like a shovel striking a coffin lid. It cracked open the grave she had spent years covering with the dirt of routine. He hadn't stumbled on it. No one stumbled onto that name. This wasn't an accident. It was a signal. A strike of lightning aimed directly at her. Her sanctuary was gone. The glass walls she had built shattered in an instant. And Clara knew with a clarity that chilled her blood that the man smirking across the table wasn't just arrogant. He was dangerous. Dangerous enough to know secrets that had cost men their lives. Dangerous enough to reach into the past she thought she'd buried forever and drag it into the light. The hum of the dining room faded behind her as the door closed. Clara stepped into the Solarium, a private chamber sealed off from the noise of aria. Above her, the glass ceiling framed the Manhattan skyline, a wash of neon and stars. The room was quiet, but the silence carried weight, like the pause before a storm. Ethan Blackwell stood near the window, his reflection fractured across the glass. Moments ago, he had been the picture of arrogance, tossing insults like breadcrumbs. Now his tone had sharpened. His words cut with precision, each one chosen as deliberately as a scalpel. "I know who you are." He began, his voice low even. Or rather, "I know who you aren't. A woman like you doesn't end up here by accident. Not with that dialect, not with those eyes." Clara said nothing. She folded her hands in front of her apron, holding her posture as if she could still hide behind the uniform. But her stillness was betrayed by the pounding in her chest. He turned, then meeting her eyes. 3 years ago, I funded an operation. Quiet, off the books. It centered on a man code-named the Falcon. He was valuable, too valuable. His information was worth hundreds of millions. Then in one night it was gone. My money, the man himself, everything. Clara's throat tightened. She forced her expression to remain neutral. But the sound of that name in Ethan's mouth felt like sandpaper on an open wound. "The Falcon didn't die because he was careless," Ethan continued. "He died because someone sold him out. A mole inside the system. A man named Julian Cross." The name landed like a stone in Clara's stomach. Cross. Smooth, ambitious, too polished even back then. She had never trusted him fully. And now here he was again, rising from the ashes of her past, like a ghost. "Cross walked away unpunished," Ethan said. "Washington swept it under the rug. The embassy pretended it never happened. And he stopped a rare crack showing in the armor of his composure. I lost more than money that night." He straightened, his voice firm again. "But things change. I've tracked him. After 3 years, I have him cornered. He's in Geneva, hiding behind false deals and coded conversations. And in 3 days, he will finally make a mistake." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. Her mind was racing. She wanted to deny him, to deny herself, to run back into the kitchen and bury this conversation under a mountain of dirty plates. But Ethan didn't allow space for retreat. He stepped closer, his tall frame casting a shadow across the floor between them. There's one problem. My translator, the man who was supposed to be by my side, was hit by a car this morning. Convenient, isn't it? He'll live, but he won't be speaking anytime soon. And that wasn't an accident. That was Cross testing me, trying to see if I'll back down. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I won't. I can't. And that's where you come in. Finally, Clara's voice broke the silence. Me. You know the dialect, Ethan said simply. You know the world. And whether you like it or not, you know the man. You can sit here polishing glasses and hiding behind an apron, or you can help me end this. His tone dropped lower, almost to a whisper. I need you. The words struck her harder than any insult ever could. This was no offer of employment. This was a conscription, a demand dressed as a choice. Clara's fingers tightened against her apron. For 2 years she had lived invisible, convincing herself she was safe. But here in this room with Ethan, Blackwell's eyes burning into hers, that fragile life was shattering. It was a devil's bargain. Step back into the shadows of espionage, a life that had nearly destroyed her, or keep hiding in a uniform that was never truly hers. And for the first time in years, Clara Monroe no longer knew which choice was more dangerous. Hours later, Clara stepped into Ethan Blackwell's penthouse. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress in the sky. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed the Manhattan skyline, but inside the view was consumed by something far more intense: walls of monitors, casting a cold blue glow across obsidian floors. The air buzzed with the quiet hum of machines. Analysts, 3 of them, dressed not in suits, but in sleek, functional attire, sat at a long black table. Fingers moved swiftly over keyboards. Their eyes flicked between streams of data, satellite feeds, wire transfers, photographs captured through lenses not meant for daylight. They didn't look up when Clara entered. They didn't have to. In this room, everyone had a role, and hers had already been decided. Ethan moved with the confidence of a man who commanded empires. He gestured to a chair, and Clara sat stiff-backed, as if she were back in an embassy briefing room. A tablet was placed before her. A password had already been keyed in. The screen came alive. There it was. The past she had run from. Not vague memories or guilty dreams, but raw intelligence. Files, transcripts, audio fragments, grainy surveillance stills, bank transfers routed through Cyprus, Panama, the Cayman Islands. A web so sprawling it seemed to suffocate her as she read. And at the center of it all, Julian Cross, her eyes locked on a photo. Older now. His once boyish charm replaced by the hard edges of a man who had lived too long in the shadows. She remembered him from embassy corridors, his smile too polished, his ambition too eager. She had known he was dangerous. She had never imagined the depth of it. But worse than Cross's face was another name buried in the files. Ambassador Robert Hayes. Clara's breath caught. Hayes, the man who had once believed in her, who had vouched for her when others doubted her youth. She had thought of him as a mentor, almost as a father figure in a world where trust was a rare currency. Now, page after page hinted at something darker. Unexplained trips to Zurich. Encrypted calls flagged as linked to Cross's associates. Patterns too sharp to dismiss as coincidence. The room seemed to narrow around her. The ghosts of Damascus weren't ghosts anymore. They had faces, dates, transactions, evidence staring at her in merciless high definition. She pressed a hand to her temple, closing her eyes for a moment. Flashes of memory came, unbidden Tariq's final words over the crackling line. The fear in his voice. The betrayal he could not name. And now Hayes's name tied to the very man who had destroyed them both. Do you see it? Ethan's voice broke through smooth, but edged with iron. He was watching her closely. Not the files, not the screens, her. Studying the way she absorbed the revelations, as though her reaction was part of the data he needed. Clara forced her hand away from her face. "I see it," she said quietly. He gave a single nod, like a general satisfied with a soldier's readiness. "Then you understand why this can't wait. Geneva isn't just business. It's justice. Justice." The word hung heavy in the room. For Ethan, it meant power reclaimed. For Clara, it meant something far messier: guilt confronted, promises broken, lives lost. By the time dawn painted the sky over Manhattan in pale gold, Clara was no longer just the woman in a waitress uniform. The armor of anonymity had fallen away. Sitting in that penthouse surrounded by glowing monitors and silent operatives, she felt it, an old part of herself stirring sharp and relentless. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was a weapon. And in 3 days she would be aimed straight at Geneva. Geneva was a city built on silence. On the shores of the lake, in marble hotels where fortunes were hidden and treaties whispered, power was measured not by armies, but by the confidence of a handshake and the precision of a pause. It was here, in the Mandarin Oriental's private suite, that Clara Monroe found herself cast in a role she had never rehearsed, but one she had been born to play. She wore a simple gray suit chosen to be forgettable. Her auburn hair was wound into a tight knot, her face composed into a mask of professional calm. No trace of the waitress remained. She was a shadow in plain sight. At her side sat Faisal al-Jamil Rigal, in demeanor the face of Ethan's operation. He played the part of the investor, wealthy, patient, discreet. Ethan himself sat slightly back from the table, his features sharpened by the severe lines of his black suit. Tonight, he was Mr. Thorne, a financial advisor who spoke no Arabic. Silent, observant. Dangerous by design. And across the polished table stood Julian Cross. He was older now, the boyish sheen replaced by cynicism carved into his face. But the arrogance that survived intact. His smile was that of a man who believed he controlled the script. His eyes swept over Faisal, then Ethan, before flicking past Clara, as though she were no more significant than the glass pitcher of water. Just a translator, furniture in the room. It was his first mistake. The meeting began with pleasantries in Arabic, smooth as oil. Clara's role was to translate into English for Ethan, but she did more than carry words. She carried rhythm's tone, the small betrayals in Cross's voice. Every tilt of his head, every pause too long, every accent mark that slipped from his tongue, she filed it away. Cross unfurled his pitch with the confidence of a seasoned trader. He spoke of capabilities beyond imagination, cyber weapons capable of crippling a nation's power grid, seizing control of financial systems, silencing airports and hospitals with a keystroke. His hands moved as he spoke, weaving the story of a fortune for sale of power disguised as software. Faisal responded in measured tones, the picture of a shrewd but cautious buyer. Ethan remained impassive, his eyes half closed, the perfect portrait of disinterest. And Clara, she translated, her voice low, monotone, unremarkable, until the moment came. Cross leaned back, pouring himself a glass of water. His tone shifted, softening, as though he were sharing a secret reserved for the initiated. Of course, he said, the real value is not the software itself, but the key. A backdoor sequence. A single thread of code that unlocks everything. That key is not written down. It is not stored on a drive. It is carried. He let the word linger. Carried. By a trusted courier. Cross continued, a man with a diplomatic background. A figure untouchable by authorities. Once your funds are confirmed, he will deliver the sequence directly. The ultimate guarantee. Clara's breath caught. The blood drained from her face, but she forced her expression to remain steady. In her mind, The name exploded like shrapnel. Ambassador Robert Hayes. Her mentor. The man who had once guided her through embassy halls, who had taught her how to read the silences between foreign dignitaries. The man who had vouched for her when she was just another junior translator. And now Julian Cross had spoken of him as if he were nothing more than a pawn, a courier carrying the most dangerous secret of all. Clara continued to translate her tone, steady, her face unreadable. But under the table, her hand tightened against her thigh nails, digging into fabric. Cross didn't notice. He never noticed. He was too busy playing his part, convinced that he was the smartest man in the room. But across the table, Ethan's eyes flickered just for an instant toward Clara. He had heard the change in her cadence. He had seen the chill in her eyes. The theater of deception was reaching its second act, and the lines were no longer in Julian Cross's control. Clara's voice flowed like water, calm and precise. She carried Julian Cross's words across the table without hesitation, every syllable faithfully rendered into English for Ethan Blackwell. But then, just for a heartbeat, she veered. Her tone didn't change. Her cadence remained smooth. Yet, hidden in the river of translation, she slipped a single phrase only Ethan would hear. Robert's package is the key. It was gone in an instant, folded seamlessly into the larger sentence indistinguishable to anyone else. But Ethan's eyes flickered sharp as a blade catching light. He understood. The trap was closing. Cross kept talking smug and unbothered until Clara deliberately shifted her gaze. Not at Ethan, not at Faisal, but at him. Direct, steady. A gaze that cut through the years and dragged Damascus back into the room. And that was when Julian Cross faltered, the words caught in his throat. His smile cracked. The color drained from his face as recognition dawned. He wasn't staring at an anonymous translator. He was staring at the ghost of his own betrayal. Panic surged, wild and uncontrolled. In one sudden movement, he shoved back from the table, his hand flashing to his jacket. From within, he drew a silver blade, small, sleek, but deadly. Before Ethan's guards could react, Cross lunged across the table, yanking Faisal al-Jamil forward and pressing cold steel against his throat. Stay back. Cross snarled, his voice breaking with desperation. No one moves or he dies. The room froze. Chairs scraped. One of Ethan's men half drew a weapon before stopping at Ethan's subtle hand signal. The balance had shifted. Cross, wild-eyed, clinging to control with a trembling hand and a blade pressed to an innocent man's skin. But he had forgotten one thing. Clara Monroe was not a bystander. Her hand darted to the panel embedded discreetly into the wall, a feature installed long before tonight. With a decisive slam of her palm, the suite plunged into engineered darkness. Total blackout. The gasp of shock. The shuffle of feet. The sharp intake of breath from Cross. For a heartbeat, the world was a nothing but sound. The frantic pound of her own heartbeat. The ragged breaths of men caught off guard, the muffled cry of Faisal as the blade pressed closer. And then, movement. Swift. Silent. Ethan's men surged like shadows, guided by infrared vision. Clara's voice cut through the dark, steady and commanding, directing them in short, clipped phrases. A thud. A grunt. The crash of glass tipping over. A cry strangled mid-shout. When the lights roared back, Julian Cross was on the floor. His blade skittered across the marble, harmless. His wrists were bound in seconds, his body pinned beneath the weight of men trained for moments exactly like this. The empire of betrayal he had built on lies, blood, and stolen secrets was finished not with bullets, but with words, with memory, with the courage of a woman who had once sworn never to step into the shadows again and who now refused to remain invisible. As the guards hauled Cross upright, his eyes found Clara one last time. There was no arrogance left, no smirk, only the hollow stare of a man undone by the very ghost he thought he had buried. Clara stood motionless, her breathing calm, her hands steady. In that silence, she knew she had not just survived the storm. She had ended it. The chaos was over. Geneva's storm had passed. But in the quiet that followed, Clara Monroe found herself facing the hardest moment of all. Not the fight, not the fear, but the choice. Back in the hotel suite, the curtains drawn against the glittering lake outside, Ethan Blackwell set a polished briefcase on the table. The metal latches clicked open with a sound that seemed louder than gunfire. Inside lay stacks of American dollars, crisp and immaculate, enough to buy a new identity, a new passport, a new life far from shadows and betrayals. For years that had been her dream. To vanish. To run so far that Damascus and its ghosts could never catch her. She had imagined quiet towns, a nameless existence, freedom in the form of anonymity. But as she looked at the money, she realized something startling. That dream was gone. She no longer wanted to vanish. She wanted to live. Ethan's eyes watched her carefully measuring the storm behind her calm face. Then, in a voice that had softened from steel to something almost human, he offered another path. Not money, not escape, but purpose. He spoke of a foundation he funded in secret, a place meant to catch those discarded by the secret wars of men, the translators, the operatives, the ones who gave everything and were left with nothing. Burned agents, broken assets, ghosts like her. You could lead it, he said simply. You know their pain. You know what it means to be left behind. They need a voice. You could be that voice. Clara's hands hovered over the briefcase. Safety or meaning, silence or voice. For a long moment, the weight of her past pressed hard against her chest. And then, with a calm she hadn't felt in years, she closed the case and pushed it back toward him. Not a ghost, a voice, not hidden, alive. Her decision was not a declaration shouted in triumph. It was quiet, almost fragile. But in its quietness, it was unshakable. She chose purpose over silence, and in that choice, she found herself again. And that is where the story leaves us. With a reminder sometimes the quietest figure in the room carries the heaviest past. Sometimes dignity hides sharper than steel. And sometimes redemption isn't about walking away from the storm, but stepping back into it, eyes open, unafraid. Clara Monroe walked into that restaurant as a woman desperate to disappear. She walked out as someone who had reclaimed her voice. What about you? If this story moved, you share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have chosen, the safety of silence or the risk of meaning? And if you want more stories of courage, betrayal, and redemption, make sure to subscribe. There are more voices, more ghosts, and more storms waiting to be told.